The saloon doors burst open with a violent crash as Thomas McCready's massive frame filled the doorway, his weathered hat dripping with Arizona rain. At nearly 7 feet tall, his presence alone silenced the drunken laughter and card games that had echoed through Cedar Ridge's only tavern moments before. Every eye in the room turned toward him, and the familiar mixture of fear and disgust painted their faces like a disease he could never cure. "Well, well, look what the storm dragged in," sneered Buck Morrison, the town's self-appointed leader, his whiskey-stained vest barely containing his bloated belly. "The freak's back for more punishment." Tom's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that words only made things worse. His enormous hands hung at his sides like sledgehammers, scarred from years of back-breaking work that no one else would do. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Morrison stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor like nails on a coffin. "You deaf as well as ugly, boy? I asked you a question?" The other men began to circle, their movements predatory and deliberate. Tom had been through this dance before. In this godforsaken frontier town, being different was a crime punishable by fists and boots. Being an orphan with no family name to protect you made it worse. Being a giant who could crush any of them with his bare hands but refused to fight back made him the perfect target. "Please," Tom's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I just need supplies. I have money." Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of humanity. "Money? From where? You steal it from some honest family while they slept?" The accusation hit Tom like a physical blow. He'd never stolen anything in his life, surviving instead on odd jobs and the occasional kindness of travelers who didn't know his reputation. His money came from 3 days of hauling lumber for the railroad camp 20 miles east, his back still aching from the work that would have taken 5 normal men to complete. "I worked for it," Tom said quietly, reaching slowly into his coat pocket. The movement caused several men to step back, their hands instinctively moving to their gun belts. Even Morrison's bravado faltered for a moment as Tom's true size became apparent in the confined space. "Easy there, giant," Morrison said, his voice less steady now. "No sudden moves." Tom pulled out a small leather pouch, the coins inside clinking softly. "Just need coffee, beans, and jerky. Then I'll be gone." "You'll be gone when I say you're gone," Morrison replied, but his eyes never left Tom's hands. "See, we've been having problems lately. Missing livestock, broken fences, strange tracks in the mud. Funny how these things started happening around the same time you showed up in our town." The accusation was absurd, but Tom knew better than to argue. Logic had no place in the hearts of men looking for someone to blame for their troubles. He'd been the scapegoat in 3 towns before Cedar Ridge, and he'd learned that sometimes the only choice was to run. "I never touched your livestock," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Prove it," Morrison spat. "Where do you go when you disappear for days at a time? What do you do out there in the wilderness?" The truth was something Tom could never tell them. He went to the places where no one else would follow, the deep canyons and hidden valleys where he could exist without judgment. He spoke to the wind and the rocks, practiced reading the few books he'd managed to salvage from his burning childhood home, and tried to remember his mother's face before consumption took her away. He hunted only what he needed to survive and gave thanks to whatever God might still be listening for another day of life. But these men wouldn't understand. To them, solitude meant guilt, and difference meant danger. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats outside, rapid and urgent. A young cowboy burst through the doors, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. "Morrison!" the boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "It's the Apache girl, Ayanna. She's missing!" The saloon erupted in shocked murmurs. Everyone knew Ayanna, the chief's daughter who sometimes traded herbs and medicines with the townspeople. Despite the ongoing tensions between the settlers and the local Apache tribe, she'd been one of the few bridges between 2 worlds that seemed destined for conflict. "Missing how long?" Morrison demanded, his attention suddenly diverted from Tom. 3 days, maybe 4. Her father sent a message to Sheriff Crawley. They've been searching, but the storms washed out most of the tracks. They think she might have fallen into one of the canyon systems during the flash floods. Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew those canyons better than anyone. He'd explored every inch of them during his self-imposed exile from human society. The recent storms had turned them into death traps, with loose rocks and hidden crevices that could swallow a person without a trace. "Well, what's Chief Nailnish expect us to do about it?" Morrison asked. "It's not our responsibility if his people can't keep track of their own." The callousness of the statement made Tom's fists clench involuntarily. Several men stepped back, remembering suddenly who they were dealing with. But Tom wasn't angry at them anymore. His mind was racing through mental maps of the canyon system, calculating where someone might have sought shelter from the storms. "The Apache are saying if we don't help find her, they'll consider it an act of war," the cowboy continued. "They think maybe someone from town had something to do with her disappearance." This brought a fresh wave of angry voices. Men who'd been ready to lynch Tom moments before were now united in their indignation at being accused by the Apache. Morrison pounded his fist on the bar, demanding order. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Morrison shouted. "Trouble follows certain people like a plague. Maybe we should ask our giant friend here what he knows about missing Apache girls." All eyes turned back to Tom, but he was no longer listening. In his mind, he was already moving through the maze of red rock and hidden passages, following water sources and shelter points where a lost person might have ended up. If Iona was still alive after 3 days, she'd need help soon. Every hour that passed reduced her chances of survival. Without warning, Tom turned and walked toward the door. "Where do you think you're going?" Morrison called after him. Tom paused in the doorway, his massive silhouette framed against the storm clouds gathering outside. When he spoke, his voice carried a certainty that silenced the room. "To find her." Before anyone could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness and rain that seemed to be his only companions in this unforgiving world. Behind him, the men of Cedar Ridge stood in confused silence, unsure whether they just witnessed an act of heroism or the departure of a dangerous criminal fleeing the scene of his crime. Tom didn't care what they thought. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond mere survival. Somewhere in those treacherous canyons, a young woman was fighting for her life, and he might be the only person in 50 miles with the knowledge and determination to find her. As he retrieved his horse from the livery stable, Tom reflected on the bitter irony of his situation. The same isolation that made him an outcast also made him uniquely qualified for this rescue mission. The same size and strength that frightened townspeople might be exactly what was needed to navigate dangerous terrain and carry an injured person to safety. The rain continued to fall as Tom mounted his horse and rode toward the canyon lands, leaving behind the warm lights of Cedar Ridge for the cold embrace of the wilderness. He'd spent so many nights wondering if his life had any meaning, if there was any reason for his existence beyond enduring the cruelty of others. Perhaps tonight, he would find his answer in the darkness between the canyon walls, where a stranger's life hung in the balance and redemption might finally be within reach of his giant hands. The storm intensified as he disappeared into the night, and the real journey began. The canyon walls rose around Tom like the ribs of some ancient beast, their red sandstone surfaces slick with rain and treacherous in the pre-dawn darkness. His horse picked its way carefully along the narrow ledge, every step a calculated risk as loose stones skittered into the void below. Tom had been searching for 6 hours, following water patterns and shelter logic that most men would never understand, but the canyons kept their secrets well. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the steady drip of water from hidden springs and the occasional cry of a night hawk circling overhead. Tom's lantern cast dancing shadows on the rock faces, creating phantom shapes that seemed to move with lives of their own. He'd already explored 3 potential shelter sites without success, and doubt was beginning to creep into his mind like the cold that seeped through his coat. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the stone passages, but Tom had spent enough time alone to know the difference between nature's voice and human desperation. He dismounted, leaving his horse tied to a stunted juniper, and followed the sound deeper into a narrow cleft between towering walls. The passage was barely wide enough for his massive frame, forcing him to turn sideways and shuffle through sections where the walls seemed to close in like a stone trap. His lantern light revealed ancient petroglyphs carved into the rock, spirals and human figures that spoke of people who had walked these paths long before European settlers ever dreamed of the American frontier. The sound came again, clearer now. A voice, weak but unmistakably human, calling out in a language Tom didn't understand but recognized as Apache. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Finding Ayanna was only the first challenge. Getting her out of this maze alive would require every ounce of strength and cunning he possessed. The passage opened into a small circular chamber, perhaps 20 feet across, with walls that stretched up into darkness beyond his lamplight. At the far end, wedged in a crevice where two massive boulders had fallen together, he saw her. Ayanna was conscious but clearly in tremendous pain, her left leg trapped between the rocks at an unnatural angle. Her long black hair was matted with blood from a gash on her forehead, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. When she saw Tom's giant silhouette emerge from the passage, her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered in accented English. "Help me." Tom set down his lantern and approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. He'd heard enough stories about Apache warriors to know that even an injured tribal member might have weapons hidden nearby, but Ayanna's condition made it clear she was beyond any thought of violence. "My name is Thomas," he said softly, his deep voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I'm going to get you out of here." She studied his face in the flickering light, perhaps trying to reconcile his gentle words with his intimidating appearance. "You are the giant the townspeople fear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose I am," Tom replied, kneeling beside the trapped rocks. "But I'm also the only one who came looking for you." The boulder that had her leg pinned was enormous, easily weighing several 100 pounds. It had fallen in such a way that it rested against another rock, creating a precarious balance that could shift with any disturbance. Tom studied the situation carefully, his mind working through the physics of leverage and weight distribution. "How long have you been here?" he asked, removing his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Since the second night of the storm," Ayanna replied, her teeth chattering despite his coat's warmth. "I was gathering medicinal plants when the flash flood came. I climbed up here to escape the water, but the rocks—" She gestured weakly at her prison. Tom pulled a water bottle from his pack and helped her drink slowly. The liquid seemed to restore some strength to her voice, though her leg remained a serious concern. From what he could see, it was clearly broken, possibly in multiple places. "I'm going to have to move that boulder," he said, examining the stone formation more closely. "If you disturb it, the whole thing might collapse," Ayanna warned. "I've been studying it for 2 days. There's no safe way." But Tom was already seeing possibilities that her smaller frame and different perspective had missed. His years of moving heavy timber and working with leverage systems had given him an intuitive understanding of weight and balance. More importantly, his size allowed him to reach support points that would be impossible for most men. "Trust me," he said, positioning himself carefully. "I've moved bigger rocks than this." What followed was a delicate dance between brute strength and precise calculation. Tom wedged his shoulder against the support beam created by overlapping stones, using his legs to create a stable base while his arms worked to gradually shift the boulder's weight. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold air, and his muscles screamed in protest as he fought against gravity and stone. Ayanna watched in fascination as this giant of a man, whom her people had heard described as a dangerous outcast, risked his own life with mathematical precision to free someone he barely knew. She'd grown up hearing stories of how the white settlers viewed her people as savages, but here was a man who embodied everything they claimed to fear about size and strength, using those very qualities to preserve life rather than destroy it. The boulder shifted with a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Tom held his position, muscles locked in place, as Ayanna used her arms to pull herself free of the gap. The moment she was clear, he carefully lowered the stone back into a stable position, the entire operation having taken nearly an hour of painstaking effort. "Can you move your leg?" Tom asked, breathing heavily from the exertion. Ayanna tried to shift position and gasped in pain. It's broken, she confirmed. Badly. Tom examined the injury as best he could in the lamplight. She was right about the severity. The leg would need proper medical attention, and soon. More immediately, they faced the challenge of getting her out of this stone labyrinth and back to civilization. I'm going to have to carry you, he said. The passage we came through is too narrow for a stretcher, and there's no other way out. The journey back through the canyons became an epic test of endurance that pushed Tom beyond anything he'd experienced before. Carrying a person, even one as slight as Ayanna, through narrow passages and over unstable terrain required constant adjustments of balance and technique. Every step had to be calculated to avoid jarring her broken leg, while simultaneously navigating obstacles that would challenge an unencumbered climber. Ayanna drifted in and out of consciousness during the trek, sometimes murmuring in Apache, sometimes gripping Tom's shirt as waves of pain washed over her. During her lucid moments, she found herself studying this strange man who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. Why? She asked during one of their rest stops, as Tom carefully repositioned her for the next leg of their journey. Why what? Why did you come for me? Your people and my people. She gestured weakly, unable to finish the thought. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the star-filled sky visible through the canyon opening above them. Maybe because I know what it's like to be lost, he said finally. To be somewhere you don't belong, with no way home. They reached his horse as the first pale light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Tom fashioned a makeshift stretcher using his saddle blanket and some rope, then began the slow journey back toward the Apache lands. He'd made a decision during the night that surprised even him. Rather than taking Ayanna back to Cedar Ridge, where the townspeople's hostility toward both Giants and Apache might complicate her care, he would return her directly to her people. The sun was fully up when they encountered the first Apache scouts. Tom saw them long before they saw him, 3 warriors on horseback moving along a ridge about a mile away. He stopped his horse and began signaling with his hat, waving it in the pattern he'd seen cavalry units use to indicate peaceful intentions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the ridge was lined with mounted warriors, their numbers growing as more appeared from hidden positions among the rocks. Tom counted at least 20, all armed and clearly prepared for war. He remained motionless on his horse, Ayanna's stretcher secured behind him, and waited. The warriors approached slowly, their weapons ready but not directly threatening. Their leader, a man of perhaps 50 years with silver streaking his black hair and scars that spoke of many battles, rode ahead of the others. His face was a mask of controlled emotion as he saw his daughter's condition, but Tom could sense the relief beneath his stoic exterior. I am Nailnish, the chief said in careful English. This is my daughter, Thomas Macready, Tom replied, dismounting slowly to show respect. She's alive, but her leg is badly broken. She needs proper medical care. Nailnish dismounted and moved to examine Ayanna, speaking to her softly in Apache. She responded weakly, gesturing toward Tom and speaking rapidly in their native language. Tom couldn't understand the words, but he could see the chief's expression changing as she told her story. When Ayanna finished speaking, Nailnish turned back to Tom with eyes that held a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. She says you risked your life to save her? That you moved stones no ordinary man could move? I did what anyone should have done, Tom replied, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The men of Cedar Ridge had made their priorities clear the night before. No, Nailnish said firmly. You did what few men would do. Fewer still would bring her home rather than using her rescue for personal gain. The other warriors had formed a circle around them, their faces reflecting various degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Tom was acutely aware that he was outnumbered 20-1, miles from any help, completely at the mercy of people who had every reason to distrust white settlers. Yet somehow, he felt safer here than he ever had in the civilized streets of Cedar Ridge. My daughter tells me you are known in the town as a dangerous man, Nailnish continued. That people fear you because of your size. Fear makes people cruel, Tom said simply. I've learned to live with it. Nailnish studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see past the physical imposing presence to the man beneath. Fear can make people cruel, he agreed. But it can also make them blind to the truth. Sometimes the most dangerous-looking person is the one who has learned the value of gentleness. As if by some unspoken signal, the warriors began to dismount. Several moved to carefully transfer Iona to a proper travois, while others approached Tom with expressions that had shifted from suspicion to something approaching acceptance. One of the younger warriors, perhaps Iona's brother based on his resemblance to both her and the chief, stepped forward and spoke rapidly to Nailnish. "My son asks if you would accompany us back to our camp," the chief translated. "Our medicine woman will tend to Iona's injuries, and we would be honored to offer you hospitality." Tom glanced back toward the direction of Cedar Ridge, thinking of the cold reception that awaited him there, then looked at the faces surrounding him. For the first time in years, he saw acceptance instead of fear, respect instead of suspicion. "I would be honored," he said. As the group began moving toward the Apache camp, Tom found himself riding beside Nailnish, who seemed deep in thought. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, and Tom felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since childhood. "There is an old saying among my people," Nailnish said suddenly. "The spirits sometimes send their messages through the most unlikely messengers. Perhaps your size, which has brought you so much pain among your own people, was given to you for a purpose that only now begins to reveal itself." Tom didn't respond, but he thought about the chief's words as they rode through the desert morning. Behind them, Cedar Ridge was already becoming a memory. Ahead lay uncertainty, but for the first time in his adult life, Tom McCready felt like he might be riding towards something rather than away from it. The Apache camp appeared in the distance, smoke rising from cooking fires and the sounds of daily life drifting across the desert air. Tom steeled himself for another test of acceptance, knowing that the real measure of his rescue would come not from the grateful father, but from an entire community whose relationship with the outside world had been defined by betrayal and violence. As they approached the camp, Tom caught Iona's eye as she lay on the travois. She smiled weakly and spoke a few words in Apache that her father translated with a slight smile of his own. "She says the spirits have strange ways of answering prayers." Tom nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges this new path might bring, he knew that something fundamental had changed during that long night in the canyons. The giant who had ridden out from Cedar Ridge in anger and desperation was not the same man who now approached an Apache camp with 20 warriors as his escort rather than his captors. The sun continued its climb toward noon, and Thomas McCready rode toward an uncertain but hopeful future, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes redemption comes not from those who should offer it, but from those who have every reason to withhold it.